Radha Nila Madhava ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. In a squeaky voice, we're going to discuss Canto 6, Chapter 15. The saints Narada and Angira instruct King Citraketu. And we're going to be discussing, not this one, we're going to be discussing verse number 6 from chapter 15. And I'm going to read the chapter summary first. Chapter 15. In this chapter, Angira Rishi, along with Narada, consoles Citraketu as far as possible. Angira and Narada Rishi came to relieve the king from excessive lamentation by instructing him about the spiritual significance of life. Paragraph. The great saints Angira and Narada explained that the relationship between father and son is not factual, semicolon. It is simply a representation of the illusory energy. The relationship did not exist before, nor will it stay in the future. By the arrangement of time, the relationship exists only in the present. One should not lament for temporary relationships. The entire cosmic manifestation is temporary, semicolon, although not unreal, it is not factual. Contradiction, right? By the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, everything created in the material world is transient. By a temporary arrangement, a father begets a child, or a living entity becomes the child of a so-called father. This temporary arrangement is made by the Supreme Lord. Neither the Father nor the Son exist independently. Paragraph. As the king listened to the great sages, he was relieved from his false lamentation, and then he inquired about their identity. The great sages presented who they were and instructed that all sufferings are due to the bodily conception of life. When one understands his spiritual identity and surrenders to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme Spiritual Person, one becomes actually happy. When one searches for happiness in matter, one must certainly lament for bodily relationships. Self-realization means spiritual realization of one's relationship with Krishna. Such realization ends one's miserable material life. So before going on to verse 6, I'd like to do a couple of things. One is a little a little summary of what happened and what's going to happen. Somehow, Angira Rishi had a sense that King Citraketu was a qualified person. Yet, Angira Rishi recognized he was too much attached to receive transcendental knowledge. So how is a person qualified and at the same time too much attached to the material conception of life? Well, that happens. There are people that are not so qualified and too much attached, and there's some people that are qualified, but at least temporarily or circumstantially, too much attached. So when he visited the palace of Citraketu, King Citraketu, being a dharmic person, received this great sage in a very proper way, and so forth and so on. And then seated at his feet, the sage asked, he inquired, how are you doing? In various ways. How's your kingdom? Are your subjects being obedient? Is there sufficient rain? Is everything going on well? Everything's going on well except one thing. And then he poured his heart out. I want a son. And he described, or we hear, how many queens he had in order to have a son. A lot of queens. More than most people. More than most kings. Too many. But each additional queen was for one purpose, to have a son. No sons. Now some good persons, or quality persons, qualified persons, understand, looks like it's not meant to happen. But I know some people that they don't accept it's not meant to happen. And they do extreme things to make it happen. And when it still doesn't happen, that was King Citraketu. So you're a great sage, can you do something? So he could have given him transcendental knowledge, but he understood he had beans in his ears. He couldn't hear. So he didn't. He didn't embarrass him, or he gave him a means by which he could have a son. And so what did Citraketu do? He took this, what was it, a mango or some fruit or something? Does anybody remember? Was it a mango? Some fruit, something to give to his queens. But he had too many queens, so he only gave it to one queen, Citraketu, and she had a son. And the other queens became envious. They weren't favored anymore. And so their hearts weren't pure, so they became envious of Citraketu, and even more so of the son. So when the son was born, it was yay! Except, as was told by Angira, the son that will be born unto you will be both a cause of joy, harsha, and great sorrow, shoka. So we'll call him Harsha Shoka. Joy, sorrow. Before he was even conceived, he had a name. So sure enough, he was a source of great joy until the queens that didn't have a son conspired to poison Harsha Shoka. So in the middle of the night, they poisoned Harsha Shoka, and when the queen came to receive her son in the early morning, she found him dead. She screamed. King heard. King ran, stumbled over his garments to get there, and saw his son dead. And there was the Shoka part. Right on cue, Angira and Narada showed up. And so that there's a sequence. First, Angira spoke, transcendental knowledge. And when the king heard this transcendental knowledge, two things, it's mentioned in this summary, his lamentation received some relief. And he looked at this person and said, "Who are you?" He said, "You don't remember, but I'm Angira. I'm the one that gave you that facility for having a son and gave the name Harshashoka, and sure enough, you're filled with lamentation." So then Narada spoke further transcendental knowledge. And that's what's summarized here. The transcendental knowledge has, the beginning of transcendental knowledge has everything to do with separating the conception of the self as the covering and instead identifying the self with the self instead of the covering. In Bhagavad Gita, this is called Brahmabhuta, so the transcendental knowledge is meant to bring one to the Brahmabhuta stage. Brahmabhuta, Prasanatma, three things. Happiness within, no more hankering, lamenting, and seeing all living entities equally. And then devotional service begins. Then devotional service begins means pure devotional service. Because devotional service can begin before we come to the stage of realization of our spiritual identity. But this realization of spiritual identity is the purpose of transcendental knowledge. Just a little sharing. Yesterday evening, there was a home gathering, and one of the questions was one of the devotees in their workplace has a number of intelligent because of their past pious activities, co-workers, refined to the degree that people are refined in Kali Yuga, of good manners and so forth. And so they ask him from time to time, why all this, religious? Why not just be good? Agnostic theism, or agnostic morality, maybe that's better, agnostic morality. There's some people like that. There's some number of people like that. So just be good. Don't do bad stuff, and prosper. So, why all this Bhagavad Gita stuff and all these other things that, that you think are important? Because it's not that Angira and Narada had to convince the king, Citraketu, that there's God, but his understanding of the Supreme was covered by excessive attachment. And there's so many places in the Bhagavatam where it addresses that situation. And there's a reason, because that situation confronts many people. Not just attachment, undue attachment, excessive attachment. And that attachment blinds one. It's called Maya. It blinds one to reality. So the persons in this individual's workplace, they can't see reality. They can't see the purpose of transcendence. So the mission of human life, and this is just a follow-up from yesterday's discussion, in one sense. How many times would Prabhupada rail about the human form of life is meant for self-realization? And so that's just the starting point. It's not yet God realization. That's coming up after Narada speaks transcendental knowledge. He then speaks devotional service. There's an interval, the break in between. So transcendental knowledge is a preliminary to devotional service, because if one cannot understand ABC, that, like Krishna speaks Bhagavad Gita, you're not the body. It's Sankhya. Krishna says that I spoke Sankhya, now I'm going to speak what's next. How you act in the consciousness that you're not the body. And with full intelligence, mind and senses directed by that full intelligence. Buddhi Yoga. So we're not at the Buddhi Yoga and the devotional service part yet. This is just the preliminary. It's transcendental knowledge. And second thing I wanted to do before going to verse number 6 is focus on something that I brought it up yesterday, and as I promised, I sent to Radha Krishna this document that's Baladev Vidyabhusan's commentary on the section of Vedanta Sutra that refutes Buddhism. If you were here yesterday, it was a topic that came up, and Buddha appeared long after Vyasadeva wrote Vedanta Sutra. So how did he write in Vedanta Sutra about that which didn't even happen yet? And there's two reasons. One, Vyasadeva's Trikalagya. No problem for Vyasadeva to look into the future and see everything perfectly. No problem. And the second is, what Buddha taught is not new. It's as old as the hills. There are conceptions of the Supreme that exist as long as the creation exists. It may not be manifest, but they are existing. And then some persons manifest them, and then some persons modify those, and you get all kinds of permutations and combinations of those essential doctrines. Of conceptions of what? Conceptions of what is the source of everything. I'm mentioning this because it's right in the first paragraph of the purport, second paragraph of the purport. Part of transcendental knowledge, which Buddhism teaches, is the temporariness of things, and even specifically. Here specifically, it's one who is a son or one who is a father. It's temporary. There was a time when there wasn't son and father, and there'll be a time when there isn't son and father. The soul will go on to some other situation, so it's just temporary. Or, another way of saying the same thing, it's an upadhi, it's not who we are. It's transcendental knowledge. Now, what do you do with that transcendental knowledge? Well, it depends on the school of thought. It's a fact. That things are temporary is a fact. And then where you go with that fact creates n number of varieties of theology or conceptions of Supreme. Because where did the temporariness come from? Or, what's the source of everything? And where does everything go unto? What's its destination? And is there something eternal? And there's lots of ideas out there in the spiritual marketplace. And Buddha picked up on one principle, and then there's varieties in Buddhism that Baladev Vidyabhusan identifies, holds them up, takes a look at them, and says it's unacceptable, or it's foolish, or it's untenable. He uses different ways of describing. It's just illogical. So rather than going into what that is, if you're interested, it's very complex, but Baladev does it. And there's the sutra, you go this way, the sutra, and then his explanation of the sutra in 4 divisions. of the fact that things are temporary. How is it looked at by different schools of Buddhism? Because, according to Baladev, Buddha had 4 principal disciples, and he gives their names, and then he gives the doctrine of each of those 4 principal disciples that differ from one another. The thing that's similar is things are temporary, but then where do you go with that? What's the implication? What's the goal of life? Not te vidu. So that's an answer from this discussion yesterday evening. That's one answer to the persons who say, why is this? We're meant to understand the purpose of life and to achieve it. Lower life forms don't have the capacity. Don't just take the notion of being a good person, but don't do bad stuff and enjoy. That's materialism. And materialism results in karma. And you don't know where that karma is going to take you. So, the human form of life is not just to have good karma, get more good karma, and go to a good place and expire. The pious results come back down again and do it again and do it again. There's another purpose to the human form of life. So that's what we're doing. We're at least trying to do, is from the assistance of, here in this case, Angira and Narada, get a clear picture about detachment from understanding the temporary nature of all things. And then what are you left with? Well, that's not that which is not temporary, or that which is eternal. And we're in the eternal category. It's Sankhya. We're in the eternal category. And knowledge, there's this Vedic couplet, Jnana Vairagya. Knowledge facilitates Vairagya, detachment. Conversely, Ajnana facilitates attachment. And attachment brings suffering. It's exactly what's in this paragraph here. Those in the bodily conception of life, searching for happiness, are guaranteeing. It doesn't matter how smart somebody is, how clever they are, how rich they are, how something. They're inviting misery. Ajnana. Therefore, Oma Jnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Salakaya. I was curious, what does the word salakaya mean? The answer is, it's an instrument used in Ayurveda for removing a cataract. Ayurveda knew about cataracts, and they knew how to remove the cataracts, and it's the instrument is a shalaka. You can go online, find out what a shalaka looks like. And physicians, Ayurvedic physicians, knew how to use it to remove cataracts. So, Om Ajnana Timirandasya Gyananjana Salakaya. Jnana works like a shalaka. It removes the cataracts, so then you can't see properly. I mean, something's out there, but you can't see properly when there's cataracts. There's light, but it's like super blurry. I mean, I don't know what the experience is, but you can't see clearly. So, like that, chakshur unnilitam yena. By knowledge, then one can see properly. And when one can see properly, at least the opportunity is there to act properly and not act with attachment. One may still have home and children and, mothers and fathers and all that stuff. The temporary, but not identifying with it, but rather seeing it in relation to the cause behind it. That's a challenge. It's really easy. The default position, become attached to it. Pretty simple. To become detached from it requires knowledge. And not just like theoretical check the box. It requires acting in that consciousness. That's where bhakti comes. As soon as this transcendental knowledge is being presented, that's where the conversation goes next. Sankhya leads to bhakti when it's done properly. Of course, it requires hearing Sankhya from a bhakta. But bhaktas aren't allergic to Sankhya. It's helpful. It's abundant in the Bhagavatam. So let's go to verse number 6. Bhutair bhutani bhuteshaha Srijatyavati hanti cha Atma shrishtair avastantrair Anapeksho pi balavat. Others chant, please. Ladies? Ladies? Bhutair bhutani bhutesha Atma shrishtair asvatantrair Anapeksho pi balavat. Srijatyavati hanti cha Bhutai, by some living entities. Bhutani, other living entities. Bhuta Ishaha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Master of everything. Srijati, creates. Avati, maintains. Hanti, kills. Cha, also. Atma Shrishtai, who are created by him. Asvatantrai, not independent. Anapekshaha, not interested in creation. Api, although. Balavat, like a boy. Very nice. The Supreme Personality Godhead, the Master and Proprietor of everything, is certainly not interested in the temporary cosmic manifestation. Nonetheless, just as a boy at the beach creates something in which he is not interested, the Lord, keeping everything under his control, causes creation, maintenance, and annihilation. He creates by engaging a father to beget a son. He maintains by engaging a government or king to see to the public's welfare, and he annihilates through agents for killing, such as snakes. The agents for creation, maintenance, and annihilation have no independent potency, but because of the spell of the illusory energy, one thinks himself the creator, maintainer, and annihilator. Because of the spell of the illusory energy. Purport. No one can independently create, maintain, or annihilate. Bhagavad Gita 3:27 therefore says, Prakrite kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. The bewildered spirit soul, under the influence of the three modes of material nature, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by nature. Prakriti, material nature, as directed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, induces all living entities to create, maintain, or annihilate according to the modes of nature. But the living entity, without knowledge of the Supreme Person and his agent, the material energy, thinks that he is the doer. In fact, he is not at all the doer. As an agent of the Supreme Doer, the Supreme Lord, one should abide by the Lord's orders. The present chaotic conditions of the world, I'll read this sentence again. The present chaotic conditions of the world are due to the ignorance of leaders who forget that they have been appointed to act by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because they've been appointed by the Lord, their duty is to consult the Lord and act accordingly. The book for consultation is Bhagavad Gita, in which the Supreme Lord gives directions. Therefore, those who are engaged in creation, maintenance, and annihilation should consult the Supreme Person who has appointed them and should act accordingly. Then, everyone will be satisfied and there'll be no disturbances. Doesn't sound like the material world. So then one can create an atmosphere of the spiritual world by bhakti. Looking for a Bhagavad Gita. There's Bhagavad Gita. Find 18:15. Twice in New York, I heard Srila Prabhupada say, once was in Brooklyn, the temple in Brooklyn, Henry Street. The next time was in Manhattan, 55th Street. Prabhupada said, this temple is not in Brooklyn, or this temple is not in New York. And his eyes get big. It is Vaikuntha. I found out later it wasn't just New York. He said the same thing in Los Angeles. The temple's not in Los Angeles, it's in Vaikuntha. So, in Vaikuntha, what does that mean? It means the atmosphere, the material atmosphere, is diminished or minimized or dismissed by the power of bhakti. Bhakti is from the spiritual platform. And the activities from the spiritual platform generate Vaikuntha atmosphere, or they dissipate the material influences. This temple is not in New York, it's in Vaikuntha. This temple is not in Houston. What? It's in Vaikuntha. How come I'm not feeling it? It's subjective, but when the place where the Supreme Lord resides, that's Vaikuntha. The deity, the altar, the paraphernalia, And those who engage, Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavir, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam, from Bhagavad Gita. All those entities mentioned, they become situated in transcendence when they're sacrificed unto Vishnu. That's how you render things that are material spiritual, by sacrifice unto Vishnu. They and the performer and the place, they all become situated in transcendence. And thus, the temple is not in Houston, it's in Vaikuntha. I mean, we deal with the reality that we have a postal address, and mail comes to this address, and so forth. And the message is, the consciousness should be enter in Vaikuntha. Going back home to back to God, it isn't just, a geographic location somewhere. It's a consciousness that one can experience in this life. We're meant to experience in this life. Not just wait for a trajectory to come and take you to a good place. It's consciousness. So, I wanted to spend a little bit of time with this statement that Prabhupada makes in the purport, where he says, in a pretty strong language, we're not the doer. Where's the verse? Okay. The living entity, without knowledge of the Supreme Person and his agent, the material energy, thinks that he is the doer. In fact, he is not at all the doer. Wait a minute. In Bhagavad Gita, in addition to saying he's not the doer, which was that verse from the 3rd chapter, there's a verse in Bhagavad Gita where he says he is the doer. Contradiction, right? Chapter 18, text number 13, Krishna says, "O mighty armed Arjuna, according to the Vedanta," Krishna is making reference to Vedanta, "there are 5 causes, 5 causes, karanani, 5 causes, karana means cause. There are 5 causes for the accomplishment of all actions. Now learn these from me." Now listen, you're going to hear the doer. Adishtanam, that's the place. Remember that earlier verse? Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavir, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam. The place where sacrifice to Vishnu is performed, the place becomes situated in transcendence by the act of sacrifice. What else? Adishtanam. So the place of action is the body. Also, the performer. Hey, karta. Remember the word karta? Kartaham iti manyate. Karta, same word. You shouldn't think yourself the karta, the doer, because everything is being carried out by prakriti. We're just going like you're sitting in a car, and you're zooming along at 60 miles an hour. The car is moving at 60 miles an hour. And because you're sitting in the car, you're moving at 60 miles an hour. But the car doesn't move on its own. Prakriti doesn't move without contact of spirit. So there's a relationship between action and the soul as the karta. But we're not the kartaham. The verse, the false ego conception is, that's it. There's nothing more. Or when you may add prakriti, so I'm doing things through the facility of prakriti. And this is where you start getting different ideologies or philosophies or different interpretations of Vedanta, like karma mimamsa. It's just work. there's no acknowledgement, although it's in Vedanta that there's 5 causes. The fifth one being the final one, the ultimate one, which is Ishvara. So, okay, now, Adhishtanam, the place, that's body, or the temple, the place where the spiritual activity is performed. The performer, the worker, the doer, is karta, so that's 2 out of 5. Then various endeavors. The Sanskrit word for endeavor is cheshta. So various, pratak vidhim, various, vividashcha pratak cheshta, various kinds of endeavors. For work, you need various kinds. So supposing you have a soul and you have a place, but without endeavor, stuff doesn't happen. You have to endeavor. Supposing you endeavor, but you don't have the authorization of the Supreme, it doesn't happen. So that's another one. Daivam, ultimately supersoul. And of course the Indriyas. And the word for Indriyas is karanam, or the instruments. So the 5. The place, the karta, the doer, the instruments, endeavor, and ultimately the Supreme. And Prabhupada indicates in the purport, obviously, the ultimate one is the Supreme. I'll read. The soul within the body is acting to bring about the results of activity, and therefore is known as karta, or the doer. Wait a minute. We're not the doer. But we're required, we're not the sole doer. We're the secondary doer, with the sanction of the Supreme and all the other 3 elements. That the soul is the knower and the doer is stated in Shruti, gives the Sanskrit. It's confirmed in Vedanta, and gives 2 of them. The instruments of action are the senses, and by the senses the soul acts in various ways. For each and every action there is a different endeavor, but all one's activities depend on the will of the Supersoul. Supersoul gives direction to Prakriti. So the verse that we read from the purport is everything is carried out by material nature. But material nature doesn't do anything on its own. It'll just sit there like a lump until there's touch of spirit, and touch of spirit requires also some endeavor, and endeavor requires senses, and ultimately requires supersoul. So one can say supersoul is the doer, one can say supersoul is yet the non-doer, because he doesn't do anything. He does sanctions. He doesn't lift things, he doesn't build temples, he does sanctions. And that's what the verse that we read for this morning. Supersoul is detached. Like seeing a child playing on a beach, making sandcastles. It's nice. It's nice child play, but it's frivolous. And the father doesn't judge the frivolous child. He may get in there and help him build one of the castles in the sandcastle. That's fathers might do that. But so Krishna is detached, although he is sanctioning. And that's part of transcendental knowledge, is to understand what we're not, what we are, and the overseer of what we're trying to do, including being covered by ignorance. So one wants it, there it is. It's his illusory energy. Why? Because we wanted it. That's pretty dumb to want suffering. Well, we didn't want suffering. We wanted enjoyment. But wanted enjoyment separate from Krishna, which doesn't exist. So you get this reflection, where it looks like enjoyment. And the senses may say, enjoyment. That's what keeps people going. There's some sensation that says enjoyment. but it's not enjoyment. Not what real enjoyment is, and wait a while, enjoyment becomes suffering. In the overall picture, birth, death, disease, and old age, that it comes with the package. But I wanted enjoyment, instead I got dukkha. It's exactly what his son, Harsha Shoka, or Sukha Dukkha. It's the nature of the place. So a wise person that hears transcendental knowledge from Angira and Narada will become detached. You can still move around in this temporary place and do stuff, but not with the same consciousness, not in the attachment consciousness. Notionally, that's really nice. Now, how do you do it? Well, sound vibration is a good start. And then becoming attached to the transcendental sound vibrator and the sound vibration leads to bhakti. That's what's coming next in this whole section of Narada and Angira's visit to King Citraketu when he gets smashed. One last thing. Don't imitate Narada and Angira. When somebody loses a child, we don't just pull out the Bhagavatam and start reading this section. Very insensitive. So don't do that. Don't imitate. They knew, and they knew their audience, and they knew what they could say, and it worked. Because it was a qualified person, just covered. Okay, 8:25. Let's see if there's some discussion.
Krishna Maharaj, thank you for the class. I would like a clarification on something that I haven't fully understand. So, in that verse 3:27 mentioned, and this Srimad Bhagavatam verse, Prakrite Kriyamani Gunai Karmani Sarvashaha. So, the false ego bewildered is. So basically, is the three modes of material nature that are actually doing the work. And now in this verse it says we have 5 ingredients of the doer.
I pointed it out purposefully.
So I don't understand so who are these? Do they have do they have some consciousness?
Do we have
three
what?
modes,
Say slower.
Do these modes of material nature are separated from, are energy of Krishna, but do they have a consciousness?
No. I mean, ultimately everything is personified. Behind everything is a person. So the 3 modes, they're personified. Is that what your question is?
Yes.
They're personified, and they're doing stuff. Now they have energy, just like you. Are you a person or not? Of course you're a person. Do you have energy? Of course you do. Supposing you say something harsh, or supposing you say something pleasant. That's one of your energies, influenced by the modes of nature. And those modes of nature, are they people? Yeah, they're personified, and they have an influence. And we're conditioned by that influence. We just bought into the illusion that I am this body, I'm Prakriti. So if that's your question, the answer is yes, they're persons, and they're doing according to the indication of Supersoul. They're under Krishna's Supersoul's direction. And Krishna's directing, he's not like micromanaging everybody, he's just omniscient and he's acknowledging. And so they act according to his indication, his omniscience. And they do this, or they, lighten up. And then another one. And this binding. And we're being pushed like waves in a river, being pushed around. As long as we identify with, it's everything, the operative principle is consciousness. And if our consciousness is away from Krishna, then we're under the whammy of those potencies, the shaktis of those three persons, the three modes. And we're just being pushed around by the waves. Making choices, but still we're being pushed around. Does that answer your question? The concept is not something we're accustomed to. We're accustomed to thinking in an impersonal way. These are just energies. And then it takes an adjustment to understand, yes, and behind the energy there's a person, energetic. And behind that energy and energetic, there's a supreme energetic person. That's a spiritual conception. Supposing one doesn't have a spiritual conception, it sounds like mythology. There was a discussion when Prabhupada in Australia, Prabhupada turned to one devotee and asked him, "You have some doubts?" The devotee felt that Prabhupada knew him. He knew his mind. In fact, he had doubts. And so he asked Prabhupada, he said, "Yes, I have doubts. I have difficulty." The way that he expressed it was, "I have difficulty with all this complicated Hindu mythology." And just that's where he stopped. And his explanation, Prabhupada leaned back, played with his Sika, that's what he said, and then said, "Don't worry, just chant Hare Krishna." I mean, he didn't try to address his struggle with the personification of all things. It's reasonable. It's not within our experience, but it's reasonable. Behind everything, there's a person. It's reasonable. But then how does the whole machinery work? Indra with his thunderbolts and his Airavata elephant and the three modes that are personified, and it sounds like people that really don't get it come up with some stories that they can explain things because they can't get it. So that's the material conditioning. And for that matter, same with God. It's a notion that people have that are kind of silly, and they can't understand things like we understand things. Everything is matter, and the laws governing matter, and that's it. And the people that can't get it, they come up with nice stories, so then they can explain things in mythology. So there. Obviously that's not your position, but how to understand that which is beyond your experience. It's hearing from the right source, and then at least conceptually, and then as purification goes on, then there can be further realization. When will that day be mine? Will I have enough purity that I can start getting some realization? But the method for realization is sound. Spuratyada. And then one gets realization. Spurati, one of the definitions of that. Atakshri Krishna Namadi. You know the verse? Atakshri Krishna Namadi, Napaved Grayam Indriyai, Sevan Mukihi Jivadao, Svayam Eva, Sparatyata. Rupa Goswami's verse. It's very difficult to understand God, but it's possible. How is it possible? By engaging in service, seva, using the senses, starting with the tongue. And when one does that, then one becomes qualified to get realization of that which you couldn't understand before you did service using your senses to the master of the senses. So stay tuned for the purification lessons. And for the time being, it's just, I have faith that I'm hearing from authoritative sources of what's beyond my experience. And sorry, but I don't have confidence in the process of mental speculation. And here's my reasons. Although it's abundant, I don't have faith. I don't put my trust in it. I don't tune into that channel. So I continue to hear from authoritative sources. Then comes, what's authoritative sources and so forth. But it's with logic and reason. When using logic and reason, we can understand the fallibility of logic and reason. And so now, what to do? Sound, shabda. That's our method. So that's how bhakti starts. So back to the question: Are the three modes persons? Everything is person. Is there something that's not person? In the transcendental realm, everything is person. There's multiple places where that's described. If you like, here's a nice one. Ready? Canto 2, Chapter 9, where Brahma is at the very beginning of creation. It's all darkness everywhere, and he does what that he heard the sound say, tapa. And after, there's different durations of time, 1,000 years, which calculation of 1,000 years, a light went on. That means Lord Vishnu appeared before him. As he approached Lord Vishnu, he saw Lord Vishnu surrounded by his potencies. So go to that section, and you'll see that it just gives numbers, the 6 and the 8 and the 16 and so forth. And then in the purport, Prabhupada explains. So in the spiritual world, there's all these personifications of things that make their way into the mature world as a reflection, or an expansion, a subpotency of the original potency. And that's reality. Now, supposing you want to experience it, well, you have to become qualified. And this starts with hearing. Hearing from the right source. Aparushaya Shabda. That's our method. If somebody doesn't like that method, good luck. We wish them luck. But we're not going down that wishing, cross my fingers and hope I get there path. We're going the bhakti path. We're selective. What the sources of sound that we hear from. We have criterion. So, something else? Kalpa, true, you usually have a nice question. Anything this morning? I thought so. Give her the microphone.
Thank you, Maharaj. No, I was just wondering, so does that mean Brahma did tapasya twice? For a long time, one when you described after he heard tapa, and then one time after the incident, after his daughter running, then...
Yeah, that's the... Chronology is what you said. Okay.
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. I was trying to understand this word balavat in this verse.
Which one?
Balavat, like a boy. Balavat, like a boy.
Like a boy, okay.
I'm not sure, trying to understand how, if it is appropriate in this verse, because usually boys, when we play around, they do not have any regard for...
They don't have what?
Any respect or regard for what they are doing in terms of building castles and other things. But on the other hand, we hear that Supreme Personality of Godhead appears in this material world and he is concerned about us. So I'm just trying to understand if the use of word balavat or the boy is appropriate in this verse.
Everything depends upon context, and it can mean different things depending upon context. Specifically the context, it sounds like, if I heard you right, when Krishna appeared like a boy, he was behaving sometimes, most of the time, like a boy. Playing, stealing, laughing, playing like a boy. At the same time, he was fully omniscient. He didn't become by yoga practice or something. Fully omniscient. So, like a boy. That's not the context here in this verse, but that's from what I understood from your question. Does that answer your question? No.
Yeah. So if usage of the word boy in this verse, I'm trying to understand
In the context of this verse.
In this verse.
Okay. Nonetheless, just as a boy at the beach creates something in which he is not interested, the Lord, keeping everything